It is my privilege to present to you tonight's event, Black Heroes in American History. This is our first event of this kind. Our organization is hoping to have many more in the future. I want to say that we are welcoming all to join our organization. Our goal is to expand and become more effective, not only in politics, but within our community so join us. I'm grateful to introduce to you our host for this evening. As CEO of Ersula 2 LLC, Ersula K. Odom is on a mission to preserve cultural history as in many forms as possible. As such, she is a publisher, a legacy wall designer, a legacy writer, and a living history performer. She is also founder of Ersula's History Shop and the nonprofit Rescuing History, Inc. Collectively, all her skills lead to preparing one story to take its rightful place in our cultural history. Ersula has an uncommon ability to relate to multi-generational and multicultural audiences by sharing experiences from such areas as rural living, college life, Fortune 500 corporate management, spirituality, entrepreneurship, sales, and genealogy. She has had the honor of portraying Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune at 2012 DNC event in Washington, D.C., and the 2022 celebration event of Dr. Bethune's statue installation. Her 2017 performance as Bethune at Florida AMU University was mentioned in the Wall Street Journal. To learn more or to purchase her books, visit Ersula2, that's TOO.com. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ersula K. Odom.
Thank you, David. And thank you to the North Tampa Dems for this wonderful opportunity. But what you just heard, all that means is don't ask me anything because I'll have a story to tell. And with that, I'll start off with a story. I portray Mary McLeod Bethune, yes, but I also give a walking tour of Perry Harvey Park. And the reason I'm sharing that with you tonight is because I think it's relative to what you are faced with, what we are faced with. Every time I go through that park, I learn something different. It is the history of Central Avenue, Perry Harvey, and the community. One time recently, I was going through and showing young people the life tiles, as they are called. And what they are is an optical illusion. So if you stand here, you see one thing. If you stand here, you see something else. And I was explaining to them, depending on where you're standing is what you're going to see. And I had one of those aha moments. I said, how appropriately named these tiles are. Life tiles. So wherever you're standing, you have one perspective. The person standing next to you have another perspective. If you don't talk, you don't have the big picture because you're not seeing the same thing. So what a better reason than to talk to someone so that you can understand what they see in life, what their experiences have been throughout their life that can benefit you. You can't live their life, but you can learn from what they've done. And that's what's happening tonight. That's what we get to do. We get to see a different perspective from the perspective of some wonderful community leaders and their heroes. So basically, we have double perspective, the person that presents and who they're talking about. And I'm excited, aren't you? All right. So, yes, I have to take it off. I'm at that age, right? We will begin with Angela Birdsong, unless that's, nope. Okay. Yes. So when he walks in, he'll walk in singing.
You tell him that.
So we have a unique perspective tonight because Angela Birdsong has a name that sounds like she should sing, but really she's related to one of the Supremes. So yes, Cindy Birdsong. And we get to hear about the Supremes through Angela Birdsong. And she is actually the host of Tampa Bay Politics on In Touch News. And she ran for County Commissioner, District 2 in 22. And we get to hear her talk about Diana Ross.
This is one of my sheroes because if you haven't taken that tour, that walking tour, it's a must do in Tampa. And I dragged the Dungies down there and they were amazed. So it's a wonderful tribute to the history of Tampa all the way back to slavery. So I hope you can do it. Now I happen to be related to Cindy Birdsong of the Supremes by marriage because I was attempting to be a recording artist back in the day in my 20s, and I met a guy named Edwin Birdsong in the recording studio, and he said, I'm working on some music with Stevie Wonder. I said, you are? And that's how we met, and we did end up getting married and having a son. So we do, and Sterling Birdsong is still around. Unfortunately, my ex-husband did pass away, but it's my goal to keep Motown alive. So of course I picked a Motown person. And I also, at the University of South Florida, they have a program called OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. And I am your Motown instructor there too. So in October, I'll have my next class, which I put together with Stevie Wonder's daughter, Sophia. She was so kind to help us out with that class. So if you get to take that class, you'll get some insights on what it was really like from Stevie Wonder's perspective back in the 60s. This is from Diana Ross's perspective, and she came from a very humble beginning, which you'll find that most of the artists were from the same general area in Detroit. It's amazing how all that talent came out of one little area. But she was raised in a ghetto, in the lower end of the Brewster Douglas housing project in Detroit, where she had to share one bed with 2 sisters and 3 brothers. But despite the obvious hardship, when she recalls her childhood, she said it still was a happy one. They had a good life. They always seemed to get together, find whatever it is they needed. They didn't have gobs of money, but somehow everybody was happy. She sang in the choir at the Olivet Baptist Church, and that's how she came across 2 young ladies, Mary Wilson and Florence Ballard. Of course, you know, who became the original Supremes. So they all met in church. They joined with a lady named Betty Anderson in 1959 to become the Primettes, and they were a sister group to the backup group, the Primes, that used to sing behind Eddie Kendricks. So sometimes you may hear them referred to the Supremes, where they used to be the Primettes. So that's how they started out. I'm going to skip a few things because I'll be here forever. But while they were still in high school, the Primettes used to get paid like $15 to perform, which is amazing when you think about where their career landed them. They started recording for a small label called Lupin. And those songs were actually released after they became the Supremes. When the new Motown company was started in Detroit, Ross and her fellow singers began hanging around the building in Detroit, trying to get noticed, trying to be accepted. And they did catch the eye of a guy named Berry Gordy. Okay, and he was the founder, CEO, everything at Motown. And they started off being backup singers behind other groups. So names you might know, like Marvin Gaye, Mary Wells. So that's how they started. Now, they didn't really have much success until Barry Gordy paired them with a songwriting group, which you may know, Holland, Dozier, and Holland. They were behind most of all the hit songs that you remember from Motown. And when they put those girls together with that group, they had their first 2 million seller, and it was called Where Did Our Love Go? If you remember that one. In 1964, they made 6 other hits in 1 year, which included Baby Love, Come See About Me, Stop in the Name of Love, Back in My Arms Again, and I Hear a Symphony, which was one of my favorites back in the 60s. Now, there was a group called Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells, right? And there was a young lady there named Cindy Birdsong who used to fill in for Florence Ballard, because unfortunately, Florence Ballard suffered with alcoholism and depression. So at some point, it became obvious that Florence was not going to be able to fulfill her duties as a Supreme. So that's how we got Cindy Birdsong to come in. And that caused a little rift between Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells, but by the 80s, they got over it. I do want to say a little bit about Barry Gordy, because along with Diana Ross and the Supremes, he helped break the color line, because we're talking about in the 50s and the 60s. It was a bad time in America. There was a lot of racism. There was a lot of segregation still going on. But Barry Gordy had a dream that he could sell Black artists to white America, and he could dress them and it was like MGM in Detroit. Because what he would do is he would make sure there were people who taught choreography there. There was people who taught them how to speak, how to be poised, how to be elegant, how to approach people, how to speak when you have an interview. So he taught them exactly how to present themselves so they could be on big shows on television. And that is how he really broke the color line. All through the South, they had to travel through there. That wasn't easy, but along the way, they were able to finally prove that music can break through any color line. Now, the Supremes became so marketable with that glamorous image. If you remember them on the Ed Sullivan Show, they always had beautiful gowns. And the wonderful thing about Ed Sullivan, he was like, I don't care what color you are. If you're talented, you're on the show. So a lot of Motown artists were able to get on that show, were able to get a nationwide audience. Now, Diana Ross quickly became the top dog in the Supremes. As a matter of fact, Barry Gordy decided to change the group to Diana Ross and the Supremes. And in 1970, she decided to go ahead and become a solo artist. And of course, we know that she went flying to the top. Now, Barry Gordy always had a dream that he was going to take Motown to television and to the movies. And also around that time in the 1960s, you were having riots in New York, and Detroit was no exception to that. So they were like ready to get out of Detroit, and they moved to California, Los Angeles. Here we come. And they were able to start doing TV shows. And of course, you probably may know some of the films that Motown actually produced themselves that were hits. Like, let me see, I want to make sure I get the names right for the movies. Well, I will. Oh, Lady Sings the Blues. Remember that one? Yes. Okay. And what was wonderful about the movies is they also gave them a chance to have great scores, great soundtracks. So they also had some great songs that came, like Lady Sings the Blues was a big one. Touch Me in the Morning came from a soundtrack. Do You Know Where I'm Going To? From Mahogany. So they started getting Oscar nominations. So I mean, coming from Detroit, Michigan, these things were all so impressive. And of course, Berry Gordy became one of the first Black millionaires in America. And he did everything himself. He owned all of his music. He produced everything out of the Motown studios in Detroit. So everything was done by Berry Gordy. Well, as you know, Diana Ross became one of the most popular singers in America. Till this day, the Supremes are still one of the top selling female artists of all time. So that's what happens when you have a dream and you believe in it and you go for it. So that's what I wanted to tell you about the Supremes and Diana Ross.
Thank you. I had an opportunity to see crossover music play out right in front of me one day, again on the tour. They play music during the summer with water bouncing around to the music. And the first song out of a dead sound is "Get Up Off of That Thing and Dance and You'll Feel Better." And the white people did. And then the next song was "Do the Twist." And the white people started doing the twist. But what was funny is the Black people started doing the twist too. I said, oh, so that's what brings us together. Music. And on that note, I understand a songbird did walk in. Special historical music performance by Pastor Moses Brown, who for over 12 years, Pastor Brown, as the chaplain for Advent Health and as CEO of Feed Our Children, has fed and inspired thousands of needy children around the world. And we get to hear that perspective and some music today. Pastor Brown.
It's a plum pleasing pleasure to be in your presence. Thank you, David, for this beautiful vision that came from his heart. And that's why I came this far, all the way from Temple Terrace. Music has always been something that meant a lot to me because I know that it is the common denominator between every culture in the world. Music has a way of solving the emotions. Music has a way of bringing back flashbacks of the good old days in the 60s when I was a kid. I heard some beautiful, beautiful music. I met a person when I was 17 years old. I was at a tent meeting. I was over the music for a crusade. And a gentleman came up to the crusade in LaGrange, Georgia. And for some reason, this particular night, the news cameras were out. I couldn't find a parking place. I said, who is this? I walked in and I saw this gentleman with a lot of hair hanging down. And they said his name was Little Richard. I said, who's Little Richard? See, I came from one of them churchy families. We listened to Moody Radio and a lot of other stuff during the day. And so I didn't know a lot of people. But I found out very quickly that this man was something else. So as I was doing the music and I came down to sit down, he approached me and said, hey, I like the way you were singing up there. I like you to travel with me sometimes. I said, well, I'm gonna travel with you. I don't sing Good Golly, Molly, Tutti Frutti. And he said, I'm preaching now. I said, okay, that kind of fits in. I was on my way to seminary there in Huntsville, Alabama. He said, when your weekends come up, wherever I am, or fly you out. That was a good life for me for a minute or two. But I remained his friend all the way to his death a few years ago. He started using me as his personal pastor. And when I did the story on Little Richard on I think it was NBC News, one of the news channels came out to my home, and they had me to follow up about what it was like to travel around with Little Richard. It was adventurous when you're out in Beverly Hills in California and see these people that you all admired and you just saw on television. But then you realize one thing I realized when I was there, I wanted what they had, but they wanted what I had. I'm just a country Plant City boy, but they saw something that I guess they left behind by being in that world. They saw an innocent, genuine happiness. And I learned that you can be happy just the way you are. And music that was cultivated in slavery came out as Negro spirituals. And I learned some of my music through Little Richard. But this little spiritual had so much in it, it impacted even Martin Luther King when he asked Mahalia Jackson to sing at his sermons. It had a code. The code, many couldn't say what they wanted to say, but they could use music as their code to speak to those who were trying to get the message across. And this song in particular was saying, soon I will be done with the troubles of the world. The reason why the masters couldn't understand that, because you got to have trouble to understand trouble. So when they were saying, soon I'll be done with the troubles of the world, master's trouble was we couldn't get the curtains in that day, or little things, but their trouble was working in the hot heat all day. And so they would say, soon I will be done. I will be out of here, y'all. Just keep watching me. So I sang this song in dedication for all those who wanted the code to come across. Soon I will be done. Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world, the troubles of the world, the troubles of the world. Oh, soon I will be done with the troubles of the world, going home to live with God. And I want to see my mother. I want to see my mother. Oh, I want to see my mother going home to live with God. Oh, soon I will be done with the heartaches of this world, all the struggles of this world, all the loneliness of this world. Oh, soon I will be done with the troubles of the world, going home to live with God. And I want to see my Jesus. Oh, I want to see my Jesus. Oh, I want to see my Jesus going home to live with God. Soon we will be done with the troubles of the world, the frustrations of the world, the heartaches of this world. Oh, soon we will be done with the sickness of this world. We're going home to live with God.
Wow. If we were in a theater, I would be saying encore. So when he said about the codes, it reminded me of something that my grandmother used to say. It was her favorite song. And I got it as an adult. She said, "You'll understand it better by and by." And that, as I grew older, realized that that carries a lot of weight of information in those words, because it was just too much for her to explain to me right now. And so hearing him talk about the code, it connected me to that moment. There's a lot that people know that you have to ask, because sometimes it's too much for them to just tell you. So if you're going through something or you see someone else going through something, ask. And it might be the time that they can tell you. Okay. Today is an awesome day. But I suspect that the person that's going to follow will tell you more about it, so I won't go there. Albert A. Fox Jr. His hero and the perspective that he will share with us today is Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Albert A. Fox is a former senior congressional staff assistant in both Senate and House, the president of the Alliance for Responsible Cuba Policy Foundation, and in 1987 helped secure the release of hundreds of children activists, helped bring democracy to South Africa. While in Washington, Albert gave a tour of the Senate floor and spent much time with Dr. King. So given today and how special this is, I can only imagine how special the presentation is going to be. Mr. Fox.
Well, thank you so much, Ursula. And thank you, David. I was going to sing a song myself, but I decided not to after listening to Pastor Brown. I have been very fortunate. I was born and raised in Ybor City. I left here Labor Day 1965. I was 22 years old. I did not even know what the United States Senate was. Somebody knew somebody that knew somebody that knew somebody else, and the next thing there I am. And the title of this gathering tonight, Black Heroes in American History. And in my lifetime, I've come to admire my father, my hero, more and more and more, and Dr. King more and more and more and more. And I want to make some comments, and then I'll tell you about the day I took him on the Senate. That when I first arrived in Washington, the only thing that I knew about Dr. King was that he was a communist. He was an outside agitator. He was a phony religious leader. And that's what most probably a good number of United States senators even believed. And I just became fascinated when the moment I met this man, and I'll address that in a minute, but why do we have this divide? I'm thinking 1966. And the reason I think that we have the problems that we still have in our society, and we don't have Dr. King's dream, is that everyone in this room, every one of you knows what it is like to work and live in a white world. But only my Black brothers and sisters know what it is like to live and work in a Black world. And until we can bring those two things together and understanding it, we're going to continue to have divisions in our society, and we still have discrimination. And as a young man working on the Senate floor, Senator Phil Hart, who was one of the great civil rights leaders, he was a senator from Michigan, and he motioned over to me and walked up to me and he said, Albert, Dr. King is in the Senate reception room, and he's here to see me, and I cannot leave the floor. Go tell him he can come back, or put him up in the gallery so he can watch the proceedings. I said, okay. I went out there, and there he was, hat in hand, very dapper dresser, and I really didn't know anything about him other than what I told you. And I relayed the message, and he said to me, well, can I wait right here? And I said, yes, sir. Went back inside, relayed the message to Senator Hart. And Senator Hart says, Albert, I don't want Dr. King just sitting out there. He said, please tell him I don't want him there. Put him up in the gallery, take him on a tour, tell him to come back. I just don't want him sitting there. I said, okay, go back out, relayed it to Dr. King. And he said, well, I've never been on a tour of the Senate. I said, okay. So I go back into the Senate floor, and I had some duties and responsibilities there, although I was a very low-level person at the time. And Senator Hart said, I'll tell the majority leader, don't worry about it. Take him on a tour. So I took him on a tour in the United States Senate. And I mean, within minutes, you know that you were in the presence of something that's just unbelievable. He had these magical eyes, and remember he said to me, he had impeccable manners, and he's talking to a kid, that was a nobody really at the time. And he said, young man, what do you do here? What are your responsibilities? And I told him, he said, well, how does someone get a job like that? And it was just 2.5 hours that when it was over, I just became obsessed with the dichotomy between what some senators I heard say about Dr. King in the cloakroom and who this man was. Today, I can't find one single human being that is critical of Dr. King, including Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity. And it angers me when I hear people of that ilk say, the problem with Black America today is that there is no Dr. King. Yet there's not a scintilla of evidence that when Dr. King was alive, they did anything but criticize Dr. King, okay? And I find that we need to find a way to close that gap. Another out of my life was in 1989. Coretta Scott King, I've got some of these at the speech that I gave, and not enough to pass out, but she appointed me as the United States Commissioner on the Martin Luther King Jr. Federal Holiday Commission. And the job there was that if we allowed the states to give Dr. King's birthday any recognition, they weren't going to do it, states' rights, and you know all those arguments. So there was this federal commission created, and I was the only nobody on the commission. I mean, on the commission was Jesse Jackson and Harry Belafonte and Senator Kennedy and Senator Dole and Stevie Wonder and lots of people. So it was another great honor for me to then travel to make sure that Dr. King's birthday became a federal holiday. And interestingly enough, you'd be surprised to learn that the last 2 states that finally agreed to make Dr. King's birthday a national holiday was Arizona and New Hampshire. Everybody would say Mississippi or Alabama or what have you. After my Senate tour, I became fascinated with Dr. King, and I'll leave you with this thought that I wanted to know more about this man. And so the first thing I did was come across, a letter from the Birmingham jail, which he wrote in 1963. Started off in newspaper, on the margin of the newspaper, and then on other scraps of paper. And when you read that, I mean, it is something that off the top of his head, he just wrote this, and it is an amazing document for those of you who have not read it. It's a document that every middle school child, every high school student, and every college student should read that not once, but over and over, because it just dramatizes the wealth of knowledge that Dr. King carried around in his head. And when you consider he was 34 years old when he was a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and 39 years old when he was so brutally assassinated on April the 4th, 1968. And minds like that just don't come along. And so every day I consider myself very fortunate to have spent time with him, had coffee with him. And on a couple of occasions, he would come back to the Senate and he would say, how's that young man doing? And are you taking care of yourself? How are you doing in school? And he just had this, I mean, you just could not help but fall in love with this man. So it is a treasure of my life. And my wife knows that my wife Ann, on Dr. King's birthday, it's a special day in our family. And we don't go to picnics and we don't do, eat hot dogs and hamburgers. But it's special, it's unique, it's solemn. And I struggle every day as I get older and older, and now 79 years old. How can we get this feeling that Dr. King wanted us to carry? Here's a man that I mean, material wealth was not relevant. It wasn't. I mean, when he passed, I mean, he didn't have any money. And that he devoted his whole life. And when he was 25 years old, he was already on the world stage. I mean, people like that just don't come along. And so I think our society, my white brothers and sisters, they need to do more to understand this. And as I said earlier, I think that all my black brothers and sisters know what it's like to work and live in a black world. And when I left Tampa, and I'll close with this thought, because when I left Tampa in 1965, East Tampa was black, poor, and potholes. And I come back home 41 years later, and East Tampa is black, poor, and potholes. I mean, there's just something dramatically wrong with that picture. And every city in America has an East Tampa. Memphis has one. You name the cities, they all have one. Okay. So Dr. King's dream is far from being achieved. Okay. In this, Mrs. King, let's see, I have to put on my glasses. When Mrs. King gave me this certificate, she said to Albert, with deep appreciation for keeping the dream alive, love, peace, and justice, Coretta Scott King. All my children, all my grandchildren, they know how proud I am of that. So with that, I thank you again, and so nice to be in the company of some enormously talented people. Thank you.
So the next time you're in the company of a young person, just know how big an impact you can have on their life. Don't take it for granted. They'll be talking about you later. So he didn't say what today is, because his memory is of all the good things. But today is the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated. 55 years. And I just find it profound that this is the day that history was made again by the president of a former president of our country. A sad day in both cases, right? Okay. Pray for how you thought. Or how I thought. Okay, next. The next person, we'll be talking about a hero that of his time was an amazing person and a courageous person. And to take it on, Jordi Zapata has to be courageous as well. So Jordi is a member of the Hillsborough Young Democrats, the Tampa Bay Environmental Professionals, and an environmental scientist at the Southwest Florida Water District. He was the field manager for the 2022 Lindsay Cross campaign, Florida House District 60. Jordi Zapata.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me in the back? A little louder? How's this? It's got me today. Oh, really? Online? Perfect. Well, thank you guys all for coming out here. I really appreciate it. David, thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it as well. We bumped into each other serendipitously, and here I am. You know, sometimes things work out in mysterious ways. Special thanks to Miss Ersula Odom. Thank you for the introduction, for hosting the event as well. Once again, my name is Jordi Zapata. I'm the newly elected president of the Hillsborough County Young Democrats. And thank you. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here with all of you today. This speech was originally delivered on Dr. Martin Luther King Day earlier this year in my hometown, at my hometown recreational center that I was kind of raised in as a second home, with a lot of staff members that had a huge influence on me. But when I was invited back here to speak about Frederick Douglass, I thought, well, I've already got one in the chamber. So much like this library here in Tampa, that recreation center served as the foundation of my community. And so I really appreciate all of you guys being here tonight, because it stresses the importance of places like this for others in the community, for canvassers, poll workers, students, after school workers, senior citizens. It's a foundation, you know, these types of spaces. So allow me to take you back. During an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket, Massachusetts, on August 11th, 1841, Frederick Douglass sat amongst a crowd feeling motivated yet contrite. Surrounded by scholars, visionaries, and notable abolitionists, there he was, a newly escaped slave, penniless, but recently married to his life partner, Anna. Mr. Douglass was the quintessential individual to elevate the movement unfolding before him. I took right hold of the cause, he said, but I could do so little. What I could do, I did with a joyful heart, and never felt happier than when in an anti-slavery convention. I seldom had much to say at those meetings, because what I wanted to say was said so much better by others. Douglass faced many challenges that day, many physical, mental, and emotional challenges. As the passionate debate ensued before him, he looked around the room, he looked at the different faces in that meeting, many of those faces very different from his, and he felt small. Frederick Douglass, the critically acclaimed, world-renowned, revolutionary orator that we know him as today, he felt small. The truth was, he says, I felt myself a slave. And the idea of speaking to white people weighed me down. Nevertheless, I felt strongly moved to speak, and there was a severe cross, but I took it up reluctantly and spoke only a few words when I felt a degree of freedom, and said what I wanted to with considerable ease. From that moment until now, I've been engaged with pleading the cause of my brethren. And so on 1968, 127 years after that Nantucket Convention, Dr. Martin Luther King arrives in Memphis, Tennessee, to proclaim his final speech. I've been to the mountaintop. And when transitioning from one thought to the next, he casually utters, oh, but I know somehow that only when it's dark enough can you see the stars. His delivery was so swift, his mind sharp, and masterful was his tone. King had that fire inside him that burned bright in Mr. Douglass that day in Nantucket. Even after Reconstruction, after Jim Crow, after the wars and the internment camps, the struggle continued. On the shoulders of icons like Frederick Douglass and countless before him, I believe Dr. King reached the mountaintop that day. In fact, he moved them. With such grace, he delivered cuts and blows so deep, Dr. King reduced the pillars of oppression to a rubble, and the crowd was there with him. Transported by his words, King illustrated the perilous conditions of the sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, and the nonviolent protesters, and the hungry, and the poor, the stars in our society who felt as though their light had been dimmed, and Dr. King was their North Star. There were dark times indeed, and many in our communities are still alive to tell the tale today. As the ears of the world heard Douglas's cry for voting rights, including that of women's suffrage, the eyes of the nation were upon King this time. The country watched in Memphis, Tennessee with bated breath and clenched fists, hanging on to every single syllable that he uttered. And on April 4th, the following day, they watched again, with bated breath again and clenched fists again. Yet the eyes of the nation wept with sorrow this time as the news of King's assassination ran out across the land. One of the brightest stars in our society, in our sky, and they too tried to make Dr. King seem like he was small. Unsuccessfully, I might add. They tried to extinguish the light of the civil rights movement. However, they misunderstood the most fascinating thing about stars is that they continue to shine bright well after they've gone. Only light years become their legacy now. I'm sure most of us have heard the phrase, think global, act local, right? Well, growing up, I had role models showing me what that phrase meant every day. They worked for the city, they worked at the library, they worked at the community centers. Many of them taught me by example, and they let me work beside them. So, allow me to leave you with this tonight. Think big. Let's play the long game. Trust and invest in yourself, in your communities. Strive to be the person worthy of those compliments that you receive from your peers. Join local organizations and clubs like the North Tampa Dems, like the Hillsborough County Young Dems, and continue to sign up, show up, hold our electeds accountable, because that's what we're put here to do. That's what the system requires. It is our duty to do it. That is a service to our country and to our community. Thank you.
I told you, you can't say anything to me. I have a story to tell. When he said, think big, I couldn't help but remember the day that I had a postcard of a dinosaur on the table outside. I turned around and a lizard had crawled up on it. So I had to take a picture of that. And I call it my think big moment. But also, when I hear about Dr. King and Frederick Douglass in the same setting, I think of the fact that we know Dr. King had this powerful voice and could deliver like no one else could. We understand that that was true of Frederick Douglass. Can only imagine what Mr. Douglass sounded like. We know what Reverend King sounded like. But there's another level. YouTube also allows us to hear what Dr. King really was like was referred to tonight. There are conversations that he had just talking with a reporter, and I think I'm get the wrong person. A singer, an activist. That one. Okay. Thank you. Harry Belafonte. There was an interview where he and Harry Belafonte were talking. And I'm telling you, it is the most amazing thing to hear this man speak as a man and as a person with head and mouth and gear at the same time. It's not from paper, it's from head to mouth to you. It was amazing. And when I think of that, knowing that that's available for me to look at, I mean, and to listen to, I only wish that we had Frederick Douglass that we could do that with. So as I look at this paper, I go, oh, Lordy, I have no idea who his hero is. But I suspect we will find out. The next person is Sean Shaw. And your mother did that to us. My tongue get twisted. Is an attorney and political leader who represented Florida in the House of Representatives for District 61. Shaw was the Democratic nominee for the 2018 Florida Attorney General election. So without knowing who your hero is, I suspect you have many, or at least you can tell us about one. And it could be you. Sean Shaw.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I want to thank you for having this. Sometimes when I do these things, I have to say I can't be political tonight. Well, I don't have to do that with y'all. Be as political as I damn well want to be, and today I'm going to do it. And I want to say thank you because we're in a state now where this is not cool to do, right? We're in a state that looks down on the word equity. We're in a state that D&I programs are literally outlawed, that colleges and universities can't have a department, can't teach it. Your tenure as a professor may be affected by it. Colleges and universities are scrubbing the word equity from their websites. That's the state we live in right now. And you were describing the 1950s and 60s, and I could have put my head down and said, I'm living in Florida. That's what's going on right now. And I was so inspired by these stories, I forgot that Donald Trump got arraigned today for a little bit. And I'm not smiling because of that. It's still a sad day in America that an ex-president gets arraigned. It's not something to celebrate, but it is, justice comes for us all at some point. And so again, it's important that we do something like this, not just for the symbolism of it, because it's symbolically important, but because of the information that's important. And I often go to places and I talk to a lot of Black voters, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know. There's some apathy there. And there's some concern that sometimes us Democrats don't insert ourselves where we should sometimes. And we're not allies the way we should be. And we're not strong enough on the fight sometimes. Our Black voters think that we should be. Things like this are important. They show that you're putting yourself where you need to be put in. And it shows voters and it shows people that you're trying to convince, not just at election time, not just a month before an election that you come and knock on the door and have a fish fry and want to get out the vote, but things like this are important. And the people in this room want to tell you it means this is more than just we're having this tonight, because I guarantee you the North Tampa GOP club ain't doing something like this. So these things are important. And I just want to tell you, it means something to me. That's why I said yes. And I drove from Seminole Heights, Pastor. So but I was happy to be here because it's important. I also want to give some flowers to someone that's in the room now, because you give flowers to people when they're there. And that's somebody who is close to the hero I'm going to talk about. And that's the former Supreme Court Justice Peggy Quince, who was the first Black woman elevated to the Florida Supreme Court and the first Black woman to be the Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court. And I may get in trouble with her for doing that, but I'll deal with that later. But you need to know that she is in your presence. She could have been any hero of us that would have done this paper. She is a giant. She is someone that every young lawyer looks up to in this state. And it's a really big deal. I was so happy when I saw you when I walked in the room, Justice. So it was good to see you. Mr. Fox, you said something, and it burns me every time MLK's birthday comes up. And it's the Disney version of what America presents that Martin Luther King was. He was revolutionary at the time. When they killed him, he was the most hated man in this country. Okay, so don't let anybody tell you that we all loved him. and that white America loved him and that he was this hero. If you hated Colin Kaepernick, you would have hated Martin Luther King. I'm just telling you, don't let the Hannitys and everyone else pick the version of him that they put up and make us think that, no, he was hated. He was reviled by this country. And he was lionized in death. They killed him. That's how popular he was. And he wasn't just talking about a dream he had about racial equality. It got into war, and it got into poverty, and it got into serious things in this country that we still need to have discussions about, that still rip at our fabric and still are not wounds that have healed. And I think you said you can't heal the wound unless you want to acknowledge the wound and you deal with it. And in this country, we like to put Band-Aids on the wound and then rip it off and then put another Band-Aid, and the wound itself never gets healed. And unfortunately, that wound is why we have MAGAism and Trump and the version of the Republican Party that we have today. And like you said, the new president of the Young Democrats, that's cool, man, but we got to work on that. We got to work on that. So my hero does have the same last name as me, and you might see a resemblance because that's my father. Okay. And he often told me I was lucky born to look like him. So that's good. You know, my father was born in 1930, Salem, West Virginia. Went to the Korean Wars. A lot of people did at that time. Went to school at West Virginia State, historically Black college in West Virginia, and went to Howard Law School. And back at that time, that was the only law school you were going to if you were Black. He was, became a member of the bar in 1960, came back. He came to teach at Florida A&M University at their law school. And the story they likes to tell is my grandfather was a dean of FAMU back in the day. And he thought my dad needed some discipline, so he made him come to be an assistant professor at FAMU. So that's how my dad moved to Florida from West Virginia and after the war. And so he ended up in Jacksonville. And Jacksonville is kind of where my father's legal career and all the firsts happened. He was the first Black ADA and our assistant state attorney in Duval County, the first Black assistant public defender in Duval County, the first member of an integrated law firm in Duval County. He represented the NAACP in Duval County, and in St. Augustine, when Dr. King went to St. Augustine, my father was the general counsel to the NAACP in Duval County at the time. So he represented Dr. King at certain times when he was in Duval County. And so a story I'll tell you is he ran for judge back in the 60s, early 70s in Duval County. I don't have to tell you how that went. But I will tell you, his opponent put up billboards. And the billboards underneath it, it just said, "Who looks like a judge?" Right. And that story has a happy ending because my father was the Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court when that judge came for a disciplinary hearing. Okay. So it does have a happy ending. But he lost that race for judge, and he ended up becoming a member of what was at the time the Industrial Relations Commission, which was like the workers' comp court at the time. And from there, it was that's where the ascent happened. He got appointed to the First District Court of Appeal by Bob Graham. Yes, we've had Democratic governors. For the young people that weren't alive when we had them, they did exist, not just in the history book. Right. And so Bob Graham appointed him to the First District Court of Appeal in, I think, 1979, and that's why I grew up in Tallahassee. So I was born in Jacksonville, but I was raised in Tallahassee because we moved there when he got appointed to the First District Court of Appeal, and he got appointed to the Florida Supreme Court in 1983 by Bob Graham. And at that time, he was the second Black person to be elevated to Supreme Court, and he later became the first Black Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court in 1991, I believe. And so, people ask, you grew up in that household, what's it like? I didn't know, really. He was my dad, right? We went fishing. He beat me at chess. We played basketball. I didn't know. I knew he was important to a lot of people. I wasn't quite sure why, but I knew he was. You're important to a lot of people, but every boy, his father is his hero, and I was no different. And so I always wanted to go into the law But interestingly enough, I didn't want to be a judge because I didn't want to follow the law. I wanted to make it, which is ultimately why I got into the legislature. I should have picked a different state, but that's ultimately why I ran for that branch of government. And, you know, we were last night, if you know, some of our Democratic leaders, Nikki Fried and Lauren Book, were arrested for protesting women's rights. Yeah, that deserves a. And the connection that I'm going to make to you is that we have a right to privacy in Florida that is specific in our state constitution that so far has protected a woman's right to choose. And it was my father that wrote the seminal opinion linking those two things together. And he and after he did it, he was up for merit retention after that came out. And merit retention is when you have to go before the voters and they either vote up or down. And he had to, at the time, it was the most contested merit retention race. It was 1992. It wasn't just about abortion. He was Black and he was the chief. So there were racial things in it. And I remember going to the mailbox and pulling out some nasty letters and pictures and threats and stuff. But he was successful in that race. And you know, one of the great things about politics is how it all comes around. When I was running for Attorney General around the state, I cannot tell you how many people remembered driving my father around when he came to visit their part of the state. How many, you know, older lawyers now, when they linked the names together, would tell me stories about how they picked him up from the airport and drove him around the community and how everyone it was an amazing time. And it was very special to me to be able to share that. But he was on the court for 20 years. And he retired in 2003, which is when I graduated law school. And so I figured out by then, I knew why he was important, right? Because if you don't know it by then, you shouldn't be in law school. But I figured out really sort of when I was in high school of why he was important and what was really going on. And I was in college when Bush v. Gore was being decided. And I came home from a break and it was like chaos, like security. And I was like, what's going on here? And he was like, you don't know, you've been in college, you don't know anything. And so he told me, I remember we went to I think it was a Miami FSU football game. And it was the only time that reporters wanted to only talk to the Supreme Court justices and not the governor. Jeb Bush walked in right before the justices and everybody was like, whatever. And the case was literally being decided at the time. And they were getting, why are you at a game? You shouldn't be at a football game. And I remember my dad saying, I can read pretty fast. It's okay. I could come to a football game. But, you know, by that time I knew who he was, what he represented. I knew his history. And of course I was awfully proud and was, you know, sometimes you avoid the field completely when you have a father like that. And sometimes you jump head in, and I jumped head in and I never looked back. But, you know, my political career, he passed in 2015. And my political career kind of started in 16. And he knew that I was interested in it and he was aware of it. But in 18, when I was the first Black nominee for Attorney General in the history of the state of Florida. And I didn't really realize it, right? Until you're just running, you're raising money and you're doing stuff. And I just won the primary and a reporter came to me and said, how does it feel? I was like, well, I won. That's pretty cool. He's like, no, how does it feel to be the first Black nominee? And I took some time right then. And that is the time when I felt the closest to him. Because I felt at that time that he was there and that there was a connection there. It's weird how those moments happen, but that happened in 18. And I also, you know, I wonder, he was in the middle of the civil rights movement. And I've always wondered how I would have acted. I know I bet a lot of us do, particularly a lot of African-Americans wonder how you would have acted in the 60s and the 70s. What your activism would have looked like and what your sacrifice might have looked like. Well, you don't have to ask a question like that anymore because it's not pretend, because it's not maybe, because it's not what if. Like we live in the state that is the best at being the worst in these things. And so you don't have to ask yourself what you would have done or what you should have done or what you might have been went back then, because you can do it now. And to your point, we all ought to be doing something. And it is not, we all don't have to, everybody doesn't have to run for office. Everybody doesn't have to be a donor. Everybody doesn't have to knock doors, but everybody got to do something, whatever that something it is. And it's not just sending out a tweet. And it's not just being on Facebook. That's not activism. That's not activism. We got to do something to to make sure that those people doing bad things know that at least they got to fight. Because it's when we lay down and allow DeSantis and people like that to just get that, there's got to be, even if you might lose it now, the fight itself is important. Not only for those that are watching us do the fight, but eventually you win. I don't know when that eventually is, but eventually you do. And right now, it does not look like we want it to look. Let me just say that. But that doesn't mean that you ought not be coming to meetings like this, that you ought not be bringing your neighbors to things like this, that you ought not be hopeful. Because if we're not hopeful, imagine our neighbors. Like, we're the ones that they think know everything about politics. It doesn't matter if it's true or not, but right? We have to be hopeful. I mean, we have to be fighting. We have to be doing this, because otherwise, what have we been doing all our time? And I'm not as senior as some, but I'm no longer a young Democrat. Unfortunately, I can't claim that. But I can say I've invested a significant portion of my adult life into Florida, and I love her. And I don't think that she is what her leaders might reflect. And I am hopeful that I'm right on that. And that means that I will continue to stay on the battlefield and continue to do things that I think he would have done, that I know he would have done, that he taught me to do. I mean, the reason I got into public service is that man right there. That is I went to Princeton University for college, and every one of my classmates are investment bankers and hedge fund guys, and they live very nice lives. I sleep very well at night because I know what I do for my country and my state and my fellow person. Not saying that they don't, I'm sure they do, but I know I do. And I know I picked the right path because I had this in my household. It's hard to live in that house and come home and say you're gonna be a hedge fund manager when you grow up. Right? That wasn't going to be the answer I was going to give, but it wasn't the answer that I had in here anyway. It was always, I wanted to follow that. It was just a matter of how I was going to do it. And so we all gotta knuckle down here. I went to California recently. I'll wrap up here soon, because Pastor, you think I'm talking too long? That means I'm talking too long, I know. But I went to California do some political trips. And when you tell people you're from Florida, they give you the bless his heart look. Y'all know what that is? You know the bless his heart? They just look at you like, we sure hope you get that under control. And it's sad that we've become that. We are not that. We didn't go from 2018 to what happened the last cycle that far, that fast. We didn't. And you're not going to tell me we did. We're not that. We're also not the state that our leaders reflect. We're not the state that other people look at us like. California, they were bragging about how they have that they get rid of moderates in the primary. I was like, listen, first things first. We need to get out of the super minority in the legislature in Florida. First thing we need to do. But this is Florida's too important. And she deserves all of us to stick with it. And this fight, it's fun to win elections. That's what ultimately you want to do. That's what it's about. But this is also, people deserve to have a Democratic Party in this state that has their shit together and that fights for them and gives them a reason to be involved and to volunteer for the party. And y'all are doing that. Teachers deserve that. The unions deserve that. Everybody who's getting their behinds kicked, women. But I've never met a white straight man more obsessed with race and sex than Ron DeSantis. Never. Everybody who is getting their behind kicked in Tallahassee deserves us to have it together. And you all are doing that. That's why it's important that you're in this room on a night like this. And so I thank you. And let's go get them.
Wow. And I was right. Just like the sound of music, I love the sound of generational pride, don't you? When ancestors do something that you're proud of enough that the descendants want to talk about it and be about it, I think that's pretty cool. The hero is in the family. For a closing remark, what I'd like to share is my thoughts about what's happening in the education arena and what's being taken away from our children. Not quite in the way that you think I'm going to talk about it. I have a redneck friend that looks like something that, you know, history wouldn't want me to even look at or talk to, right? We have been friends now for like 10, 12 years or so. I haven't seen him maybe in 8 or 9. But here's what we have. I get a phone call. Ersula, Odom, how the heck are you? Now, I want to know what you think about. And he'll say something. I go, oh, Lord, you didn't say that, did you? Well, what if I said this? I said, no, don't do that either. Well, I was just thinking, I know your heart's right, but don't do that. And he actually said to me, you're the blackest person I know. I said, thank you. But my point in that is if you can't, well, what's being taken away from our young people is the ability to have somebody in their life that they can just say whatever the heck they want to say and find out what it really means. Because without that ability, you have time bombs out there. Somebody can walk up to me and say something that just make my blood boil, and they don't even know it. Because they're saying something that is coded by history, and they have no idea what they just said to me. And the reverse is true too. I have no idea what I just said to you unless you tell me. And if we're being, if the ability to have these historical conversations are being shut down, that's what it means. We're walking around on eggshells and time bombs. Because we don't know what we don't know. And with that, we've had some wonderful perspectives shared tonight, and I am so pleased to have been a part of it. Thank you so very much for asking.
Ersula, tell us a little bit about your books.
You really want to know? Okay. I am an author and a publisher. So I have written books and I've published books. The first book I wrote was At Sula's Feet, The Life Lessons Learned at My Grandmother's Feet in the Backwoods of Georgia, right? But what I have focused on thereafter are the stories of the average and ordinary person that's walking around in our community. She walked in here and only one person recognized who she was. And that is such history. I know her from way back too, oh, okay. All right. Let's get that straight. All right. But the point is, you have history walking all among you. You probably have some stories that if someone just asked you about it, we would be blown away. And so I seek out those stories, and that's what you have over there. The story of Rogers Park golf course, starting with G.D. Rogers, the man that walked from Georgia to Bradenton and have multiple businesses. Things named for him from East Coast to West Coast of Florida, and even in Savannah, Georgia. Lee Davis, book written by his daughter, supposedly, and I think it's a debate between Rogers and Davis, first Black millionaire in Hillsborough County. But the story that's interesting about him is that, yes, you have to look, he doesn't look like a Black man, does he? But he is. His wife, you had no doubt, he had to put her in the back seat of the car, cover her up with a blanket, so that when he went through certain counties, they wouldn't detect that he was a Black man or even a white man with a Black woman. Okay. Doris Ross Reddick walked into her house to write a story for a newspaper, and I looked around and she had all these wonderful generational pictures. And I said, Miss Reddick, you need to write a book, because I've never seen, one household with all of these pictures that go back so far. She said, honey, I don't know how to do that. And she said, you're going to have to help me. So that's what I did. I helped her write her story. Now, the gem in there is that her great-grandmother was an enslaved woman. She had 2 children after emancipation, multiple children, but 2 of them to point out, 2 daughters. One was a a nanny to one of the McKay children. She had a daughter named Clemmy, and Clemmy had a daughter named Doris. The other daughter was the nanny to Cecile Waterman Estridge. So Cecile became the first white woman to chair the school board. Doris became the first Black woman to chair the school board, all within the same love cycle, right? One blood, the other not. But what was really nice about that is within that, an enslaved woman, former enslaved woman, was the result of, or had an impact on the lives that resulted in 3 schools named after people that I named in that cycle. There's a school named after Clemmy James, there's a school named after Doris Ross Reddick, and there's a school named after Cecile Estridge, all who loved this woman. And when one of the children that she took care of was a McKay child, and she was retiring, Doris went to that retirement and said, Doris, what did Mother Hattie say to you? And Shirley McKay said, same thing she said to you. The lessons were universal. The lessons continue to this day, even through Doris's daughter, who's now teaching young people, young women, how to play golf. And I have tiny books that are called tiny books because they're small enough to fit in your pocket, but big enough to change your life in each case. One book, oh, it's not there. I shouldn't talk about it, but I will. There's a book about a woman who had a stroke, and she described, okay, whatever that word is, what it was like to have a stroke. Well, a relative of mine, I was talking to about that, along with the story that my uncle told me about his having a stroke. That person ended up in the presence of someone that was having a stroke and did not know it. From what I understand from the stories that are told, the people that are having the stroke don't know it. You do, but they don't. They think you're crazy. Why you ask me to hold my hand up? Why you ask me to do? They don't have a clue, according to them, because their brain is intact, their body is not responding. And so little books can change a life, even if it's just one life. All right, so is that enough? Because I can talk some more. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very much. I want to thank you all for coming to tonight's event. I want to thank the staff of the North Tampa Dems Executive Board for volunteering. I want to thank all of our speakers, Albert A. Fox Jr., Jordi Zapata, Angela Birdsong, my good friend, Pastor Moses Brown, and Sean Shaw for giving these wonderful stories. I want to thank our host, Ersula K. Odom, for giving such a wonderful hosting of this event. It's our first event. We have a